Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, it's a tricky one. Glucose or blood sugar interpretation is quite the roller coaster ride, and there's a lot of experts out there, right, who can claim that they know best and they know the secret, and they're the only people that can interpret. But the fact of the matter is, everyone is so different. And a lot of it depends on your life and the context for your health. It could also depend on what tools you use. So there are a lot of different ways to measure blood sugar, blood glucose. Some tools may be better at assessing one thing over another. But I would argue that foundationally, understanding what blood sugar means in your body, right, is kind of first and foremost getting a sense of what your baseline is, right? So figuring out, how do you want to assess? So you might decide to do finger sticks, or you might decide to do a sensor that you wear that monitors continuously. And you might decide to pick a period of time, maybe a week or so, and collect some data and get a baseline. And then you might start to look at other things in your life, right? Your food, your activity, your stress, your sleep, your medications, changes in your health status, and look to see if we pull levers and strings in one area, do we see that reflected in our glucose? And then from there, we can make a connection, because one person might see pretty profound changes when they exercise, and another not so much. Their changes come more from food or from starting a medication. So I think first and foremost, figure out what's your baseline,
How do you want to measure it? And then how can we look at all the variables that factor in? Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, it happens more than you'd think, right? When we first get a diagnosis or we are asked to start thinking about blood sugars, right? Maybe we've had a pre-diabetes scare or just like a random high blood sugar. And so blood sugar is kind of on our radar, right? We're being asked to think about it. The big question is like, what do we do? Where do we go, right? And we might not even have any context for what's normal. There are a lot of reference ranges out there for when someone gets diagnosed with diabetes, right? We have very clear guidelines. But for somebody who maybe doesn't have diabetes or they just have prediabetes, the guidance isn't always as clear cut. And even for people living without diabetes, for someone who tracks their blood sugars, you will see occasional glucose spikes that might give you pause for concern, but understanding them in the context is important. So when I see somebody for the first time, right, who's saying, hey, I've been told I need to keep an eye on my blood sugars, step one is figuring out how do we want to monitor them, right? It's just like when you say, I want to lose weight. Well, how do we want to measure? Are we going to step on the scale? Are we going to do a tape measure? Are we just going to go by your pant size? Like, let's figure out some way to measure and mark your progress. And so we might do a finger stick. We'll say once daily, let's wake up in the morning, finger stick. Or we might say, let's put a CGM sensor on. And then for a few days, let's figure out which baseline is, right? Where are you starting from? And then let's take a look at what you like to eat, right? Walk me through a day. What does a day look like for you? We then might look at certain things in that day that are supportive of good blood sugars, right? We know that there are foods that are whole grain, foods that are high in protein and healthy fats tend to be more supportive. We might look at foods that make diabetes or blood sugar management more challenging, right? Beverages we drink with a lot of sugar, refined or processed things, right, can make it challenging. So we'll start looking at the foods that someone might like, to eat in the day and look at either if they are supportive or if they bring challenges or hurdles. And then we might match them up more specifically, right? And say, hey, here is a day where you had a lot of foods that maybe weren't so great for blood sugars. How can we make some swaps? Or how can we put together a plan, right, to help you work towards better blood sugars, more aligned with your expectations or maybe your doctor's expectations? So it is a bit of a give and take, right? Under no circumstances would I wipe the slate clean and give somebody a cookie cutter meal plan and say, that's it, you need to eat salad every day. Because I would be pretty sad if someone did that to me and I probably wouldn't follow it. And it oftentimes is not even necessary. So we want to do this give and take of just what do we need to change, right, or modify to see results while still allowing someone to live their life, right? Their life and keep their routine and sharing the joy of that routine with their families. Yeah. 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 So, yes and no, it depends. When we're prescribed a medication for blood sugar management, I think sometimes the first thought or impression is like, oh, I failed, or my doctor doesn't believe in me, or I've really screwed up, right? And so I've passed that window for healthy lifestyle, and now I just need to go straight to meds. But the reality is they both can happen at the same time, right? We don't wait for someone to have a heart attack before we give them a blood pressure or cholesterol med. They can work in tandem. So when someone starts on a medication for blood sugars, depending on the type of med, we can make specific nutrition and food recommendations to help that person be successful on the med. So there are absolutely some meds that are dependent on meal and meal timing. When we look at oral meds, there's a class of medications that help your body make more insulin, right? Called sulfonylureas. Absolutely need to be taken with food. Otherwise, you could have like shaky hands and low blood sugars and not feel good. There are other medicines like metformin, for example, that may or may not depend on food. Some people will say, I feel better if I take it with food, and others say it makes no difference to me. So the type of medication matters. And that is largely because we know that there are many ways to target high blood sugars. We can look at your pancreas. We can give you meds that target your muscles. We can give you meds that target your kidneys. And so depending on how the med works will often shape that nutritional guidance. And so if you're working with a pharmacist, you'd be working with a dietitian. They really go hand in hand. Mhm. Yeah. Can be a very personal and even sensitive topic, and it kind of depends on who are the parties involved. And for a long time, the messaging around diabetes has been that traditional foods are bad, that traditional foods can't coexist with blood glucose management. And I think, I believe that we finally come full circle and have said, wait a minute, people have been eating traditional foods for thousands of years and not had issues with blood sugars. It's only in the last 50 to 75 years, right, with the onset of a lot of packaged, processed, food additive foods, not traditional foods, that we've seen this huge rise in metabolic health issues like weight, blood pressure, diabetes. So it makes you stop and wonder, wait a minute, were the traditional foods the healthy foods all along, right? Is it now these packaged, processed, think what you might get largely at 7-Eleven that may be more problematic than ever before? And I think we're finally coming around in the medical community to that being a real valid conversation. And so that's been step one, is acknowledging that, oops, maybe we were wrong, right? That traditional food actually is protective. And it's not always the food itself, but it can be the traditional food way. It can be the way of harvesting, the way of preserving, the way of cooking, the way of creating, that connection to culture, cultural identity is part of that healing or restorative or healthy process. And so even thinking about we think about the way that a food might have traditionally been prepared, especially if something might need time and space, like a cured, like a fermented food, right? That those need to be part of the conversation. So step one, we're coming around to the traditional foods really being an important conversational point. Number two, we're also seeing it through a more contemporary lens. So we're saying, okay, I do not do manual labor anymore, right? I don't work on a a ranch. I don't work on a farm, right? My grandmother, she worked on an orchard, picking plants and picking fruit. I don't need to deep fry my food in lard anymore because I don't do that kind of intensive labor. So how can I make traditional foods, but more through a contemporary lens that says, I kind of sit in an office. I don't do a ton of manual labor, but I still want the taste and texture and flavors. And so bringing that component in too. And so we look at more ingredients, or we might look at food preparation and say, okay, do we need to use lard? Maybe we can use like a corn oil, or maybe we can steam something or bake something instead of deep fry. So bringing those traditional foods along for the ride, but maybe taking that contemporary approach into how they fit into our current lifestyle and maybe what we can even have access to, right? Grocery store, it's hard to find lard, right? That's not really in the grocery store anymore, but it's much easier to find things like coconut oil or coconut butter. And then the third way would be looking at how we might pair and portion the foods to meet our glycemic goals. So if we're wearing a sensor and we're tracking our blood sugars and we're like, gosh, every time I eat this particular meal, I really see my blood sugars go up. I want to keep the meal, but how can I put a better strategy in place? We might look to how we might pair it, how we might scale it back, how we might do meal ordering, right? There's a lot of research that says when we start with things like protein and produce, and we follow them with the starch, the rice, the pasta, the flours, the tortilla, right? That we might see better management of our glucose. More than anything can be shifting the focus to the lifestyle at large, right? Because when we think about blood sugar management, yes, food is a part of it, but so is our muscle mass, so is our sleep and rest. And we might see our sensitivity for these sugars improve as we're able to build more muscle or as we're able to get into deeper restorative sleep. So it's a bigger conversation than like, let's just throw out your traditional food or traditional foods don't fit, because that is missing the bigger picture if that's where we beeline to, because it feels easy to pinpoint. Yes, lots of food. So I'm seeing clients from all over the country. I'm based in Denver, and I do a lot of work with the indigenous tribes here. So we see a lot of Navajo, Hopi, Apache. In this community, there's a lot of sensitivities to gluten and to dairy. And when we think about First Nation foods, right, what were the foods that were here before contact? It wasn't a lot of wheat, right? Because that was a European introduction, and it wasn't a lot of dairy because that was like a Middle Eastern, Portuguese, right, introduction. And so dairy-free, gluten-free was pretty inherent to most foods. And so then the conversation comes, well, where do we get calcium from? And so there isn't a lot of information about traditional foods and calcium resources, right? And so what I've found is that a lot of the local universities tend to be a really good resource. So a very common traditional dish that is made by Navajo and Hopi is blue corn mush. And it includes blue corn that is dried and ground down and mixed with juniper ash. So juniper is an herb or a brush that grows in the Four Corners, and it's collected and harvested and ground down into an ash. And researchers at the University of Arizona took that ash into the lab, and they found that 1 tablespoon of ash has the same amount of calcium as a cup of milk. We're like, whoa, a cup of milk. Here's the my plate, right? Or I guess it's not the my plate anymore, but what was the my plate saying everybody needs a cup of milk at every meal? And traditional wisdom of the Navajo would say, oh no, you could have a tablespoon of juniper ash in your blue corn mush and get more than enough calcium. And so I'm finding that a lot of this information is coming from like the local universities, it's coming from people in the community that are demanding and doing the research to put it out there. Because you're right, it's not in the textbooks, and it's certainly not in the dietary guidelines, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. So I think about CGM as the ability to lift up the hood, right, and see the engine of the car in motion. We can't, most of us can't really feel much glucose effects, right, until we're very low or very high. Most people say they don't feel much. And this could be the same whether you were diagnosed as a child, whether you're diagnosed as an adult, or whether you don't have a diagnosis, but you're just trying to understand your blood sugars. Most of us can't feel it. And so traditionally, right, the ask was to do a finger stick. But more recently, there are devices, right, you could place on your arm or your abdomen. And every either 1 minute or 5 minute, they take a little measurement of the amount of glucose that's sort of in the tissue around that little device. And they're about the size of a quarter. They're very low invasive. And they've become much more accurate over time. And they really can show us minute by minute or 5 minutes by 5 minutes how our blood sugar reacts, right? And goes up and down in response to all the environmental triggers. The big one being food, but we also know physical activity, sleep, rest, stress, altitude. I mean, you name it. There's a whole master list of things. For a lot of folks, as they age, for women, as they go through menopause, we see pretty significant changes in baseline glucose. And so that tells us a few things. One, as we age, we probably need to shift our nutritional approach, right? It's unrealistic to expect the way that we eat at 21 is the same way we should eat at 81. But that's kind of the message, right? It's like once you're not a kid anymore, you have the same nutrition until you're in a nursing home. And that's really missing the nuance of how our nutritional needs change. And so by looking at glucose, we can get a sense, how sensitive are we to the starchy foods that we eat? Perhaps we need to maybe shift some of our foods, or we need to shift our composition, right? And think about gaining muscle. So it can really help drive some of the conversations that are happening in the pharmacy, in the doctor's office, even in the gym. If you're like, gosh, I want to start an exercise program, right? Understanding your metabolic health or your glucose can help shape that conversation. So it's bringing a lot of context. Now, is it the only value we should look at? No, many, many values, right? But it can help guide these discussions of like, am I really caring for myself in the best way as I age through adulthood? Yes, I'll tell. Yeah, I'll tell you the one that surprised me the most was alcohol. So I wear CGM off and on periodically. I'm wearing one now, and about 2 years ago, I made a commitment to reduce alcohol intake. It just wasn't serving me, and I was doing it more out of habit than enjoyment. And here in Colorado, we love our beer, right? We have so many beer options. We also have a lot of health-minded individuals. And so when those come together, we have a lot of non-alcoholic beer options. And I thought, oh gosh, that's a great option. It's non-alcoholic, but it's made in Colorado, it'll be great. And my blood sugars were through the roof, because it was still the starch that came from barley. So it was still the carbohydrates from the barley, but had none of the alcohol, which tends to cause blood sugars to go low. Not because we need to drink alcohol to make our blood sugars go low, but because our liver has to detox alcohol and therefore can't really supply us with this baseline level of glucose. So here I was thinking I was making like a healthy choice, and my blood sugars went through the roof with a non-alcoholic beer, and that surprised me. So it made me think, okay, I need a better strategy, right? Maybe I can't drink non-alcoholic beer on an empty stomach. Maybe I'm going to have to pair it with something else, or maybe I have to switch the type. It can't be a porter, right? Or something that's deep and dark. So things like that, I think, really surprise people. We have this perception that they're going to look one way, and then when we actually see the data, it's reflected elsewhere. Otherwise, and we can also use the data to help us understand why we might feel or act a certain way. So it's very well documented that when we get a rush in blood sugar and then a crash, it can trigger desire to eat again. And so we've seen glucose monitoring used in tandem with weight management or weight loss, saying, gosh, why do I get these intense cravings? And they'll go and they'll look at their glucose and they'll go, oh, because my glucose is crashing. And we can see that pairing. And I liken that to, like, after Halloween, you get all this candy, you eat it all, your blood sugars crash, you feel schlumpy, you need more candy again, right? We could see that with our kids in plain sight, but really seeing it in action can help us understand, why we might feel a certain way, and then hopefully put together a strategy or a plan. No. Yes. There are some overarching concepts that apply to everyone. Um, Foods that are considered more whole foods, right? Closest to how they might resemble what they look like coming out of the ground, tend to be lower, I use air quotes here, lower glycemic, in the sense that they cause a lower glucose response. And as we take a food and we break it down and process it into different things, we can expect that food to have a higher glycemic response or a higher glycemic number. I use the example of an apple, right? So you can take an apple from a tree. You have a very clear image in your mind what an apple looks like. An apple has the peel, it has the flesh, it has the juice. It's a fairly moderate to low glycemic food. Kind of depends on the apple and how big it is, but we can consider that to be a pretty supportive a food that's supportive of glucose management. So you could then take the apple and peel it and mush it and make applesauce, right? And because we've taken the peel off, the fiber, and we've mushed it down, we've made it easier to eat, it's going to cause our blood sugars to go up a little faster. We could then take that applesauce and juice it, right? And make apple juice. Apple juice make your blood sugars go up a lot faster, right? And then we could take that apple juice and mix it with sugar and gelatin and make apple gummies, make a candy, from it, right? And that hits your mouth. You don't even have to swallow it, right? You could suck on a hard candy and that apple gummy or that apple candy is going to dissolve. So think about that across the spectrum. Take a potato to a potato to a French fry to a potato chip to potato starch, right? We can follow it downstream and think, okay, with each level of stripping away fluid, stripping away fiber, this food is going to hit our system a lot faster and make our blood sugar spike. So there's a time and a place for all of them, but more often than not, we want to think upstream, right? How can we go further upstream to support good blood sugar management? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Above all else, recognize that the biggest driver of whether someone gets diagnosed with diabetes is genetics, both type 1 and type 2. Both type 1 and type 2. The biggest driver is genetics. It's not because you did something wrong. It's not because you did something bad or you didn't care for yourself. Genetics. Number two, the second driver, especially of type 2 diabetes and prediabetes, is going to be the natural aging process. So really recognize that age is a factor. And know that it's not a barrier, but it is a factor. Number three, then, is really be open to being honest, right, with the foods you eat and what is supportive, what could be modified or shifted, right? Recognize that we want people to keep the foods that feel special to them, those foods that feel like day-to-day substance sustainability. The goal would be never to like pull the rug out from under you and give you a generic cookie cutter meal plan, because that serves no one. Right? It's this collaborative approach of like what needs to happen to improve your health versus what would be nice if it happened. And we'll always start with the what needs to happen first. And then we can start talking about what would be nice if it could happen, to make it more realistic and approachable and big picture thinking long-term health outcomes, right? So sometimes I have folks coming to me and they go, my doctor told me an A1C of 7 or lower is fine. And my A1C is 6.5, but I need it to be 6.3. And I'm thinking, well, what is the difference between 6.5 and 6.3? Like, you're going to give up all the potatoes just so that you can drop 0.2 percentage points. That doesn't seem worth it to me. And so my hope is that if someone meets with a dietitian, they really talk about like the value of the change. Where are we going to see the return of the investment versus where are we just like splitting hairs here because you're a perfectionist and you have this number in your mind that you need to hit. So it's important to think about that part of the conversation too, that we can get really numbers driven and kind of lose sight sometimes of like, okay, the end goal is for you to live long, but also to have good health span. Yeah. If I only had 5 minutes with you as my client, yeah, I would say, generally when we have these really short visits, it's this conversation of like, what is your goal? What do you want? Right? What do you want from your health? What do you expect of yourself? And then when we look specifically at food, I call it picking low hanging fruit. So what are the top 3 things we know immediately help anyone with metabolic health? It's 1, reducing their sugar sweetened beverages. It's 2, it's usually adding in leaner protein. And 3, it's adding in fiber. So if I only had 5 minutes with you, I would say, how do we get rid of your added sugar? How do we add more lean protein? How do we add more fiber? Mm. That everybody, so diabetes is progressive. Diabetes is progressive. We don't say it because it feels uncomfortable and it feels like negative and pessimistic. But from a body, from a physiological, from a science standpoint, diabetes is progressive. And the name of the game is to slow the progression, maybe even stop it in its tracks, but really recognizing that what you do, chances are at some point will not work as well anymore, right? The medicines you take, what people will hit a point when they say, oh gosh, it's really just not doing what it used to do. And going into this with that knowledge and understanding can help set us up for more realistic expectations. It's not because you're not doing the right things, it's because we should have told you from the get-go that diabetes is progressive. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think the clinician side, right, is trying to find a science answer, a scientific answer, going like, at the DNA level, what could be different? And that's maybe not always the best approach, right? Because it overlooks the social, historical, cultural components that drive someone's risk for developing diabetes. And one community, again, I'll refer back to like First Nations, Navajo, Hopi, Arapaho communities or tribal nations here in the Four Corners area, is there's a lot of work being done around trauma and trauma-informed care and looking back in history and saying, okay, it really wasn't too long ago that these communities experienced forced relocation. They experienced the food commodity system where they were moved from their homelands, they were taken away from traditional foods, they were moved to new land where they didn't recognize the food, they didn't, and coming from a culture that's very rooted in working from the land. All of a sudden, you're in a new area and you're looking around, and you're like, I have no idea what this food is. Then they were given these commodity boxes with a lot of like lard and flour and cheese, and we said before, right, that there's really no context for gluten and dairy in indigenous foodways. But then here's a big box of cheese and flour, right? And you're like, what am I supposed to do with this? So looking at food through that and looking at the experience through that lens, right? That there is cultural trauma, there's historical trauma. We know the science says that historical trauma can impact our genes and genetics, right? We have a lot of studies from World War II, like the Dutch famine study that says moms who were pregnant during scarcity actually experienced genetic changes or epigenetic changes to their babies. And their babies who were inside them during the war were much higher risk for diabetes, much higher risk for obesity because they experienced food scarcity. They experienced high levels of cortisol and stress. And it doesn't have to be that immediate trauma. We can see epigenetics transcend generations. So we're having this conversation around generational trauma. Now, this doesn't mean that every community, every Black and Brown community is living through generational trauma, but it is worth exploring and considering, right, how that factors in. And so providing diabetes care and support and education through that lens can help us understand why me, right? Because right now the messaging is, well, you're not eating well and you got the wrong genes, but we're kind of missing the fact that a lot of things have happened historically that have shaped access to food, shaped the genes, right? Epigenetics. And so hopefully we're coming to these clinic appointments with a more nuanced discussion and saying, okay, first step, let's just talk about this and recognize that it's a factor. And then two, moving forward, how can we use this information to help you make informed decisions, help break the cycle, help shape the genes and genetics maybe that your offspring experience? It's a big question. It's a big endeavor, but I've been really impressed with a lot of the conversations that are happening at the community level, throughout the states, at least. Yeah. Mhm. Pushback question. Pause for a minute and really consider whether that is the problem or that's just an easy thing to say, an easy thing to point at. Um, from our discussion so far, we've kind of accepted or kind of come full circle and embraced that traditional foods are healthy and are healthful. And if someone is experiencing elevated glucose, that maybe that we just need a little different strategy. It's pairing, it's preparation. One of the strategies that always that I bring up a lot in my session is we can take a starch like a rice or a potato, cool it, and it becomes a more resistant starch. So why is rice, when it's Mexican food, unhealthy? But rice, when it's sushi, we can sell it for $40 a roll in a New York City restaurant and call it a health food. Rice is rice, right? But one of the, perhaps preparation wise, that rice for sushi has been cooked and cooled. And so it's now a more resistant starch. And so we have a lot of families that eat traditional foods, but they will, for their starches, right? A lot of times they'll just cook them at the beginning of the week and then they'll reheat them. So reheat potatoes, reheat rice. And that adds a layer of resistance to that starch and they won't see their glucose excursions. We can also think a little bit too about like rice is a one word for a lot of different foods, right? And we have 50, 60 different types of rices. And the rice you get at the grocery store down the street probably isn't anything like the rice that was made 100 years ago. And even in the native community, right here in the United States, up in the Mystic Lake, like Mdewakan Sioux, they harvest wild rice and it's black, it's beautiful, and it's really nutty and chewy. And it takes an hour to prepare, right? You really have to slow cook it. But this type of rice is fantastic for blood sugars. So rice is one word for like hundreds of different foods. And I, again, would really question, dig in, explore, like, okay, when you say rice, are you talking about like some microwavable rice that you're getting at 7-Eleven? Or are you talking about like my traditional black rice, right? That's from the Mdewakan Sioux community, because it's wildly different from a nutritional standpoint. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. The only other nutritional strategies you could consider adding in are some of the like homeopathic remedies. So think like ginger or ginger chews, chamomile, lavender, lemon balm. So different like scents or oils, teas, infusions can be really helpful. And we often use these in pregnancy, right? Because there's really not much you can take when you're nauseous in pregnancy. And we'll use them a lot of times in oncology or cancer, right? Because again, not much you can take. So pressure points or acupressure can be helpful too. You have some pressure points in your ankle. You can press and hold or massage that can help with nausea. So if you Google like pregnancy tips nausea or oncology tips nausea, you can find a lot of homeopathic suggestions as well. Yeah. I'm ready. I'm ready. Oranges. Yes. Yeah. We can make it work. Yes, but less. Oh, sugar causes diabetes. More water and more water. Let's go with like lean protein. So like chicken or eggs. Oh, sleep, deep restorative sleep, right? At least 7 hours makes a huge impact. Yeah, you can find me at my website. So it's my name, sarahhormachea.com. You can also find me on Facebook and on Instagram, though I may be less interesting in those venues, but I do write a new weekly post, an article about something relevant in diabetes care and education. So I encourage you to follow. You can subscribe to get it delivered directly to your inbox.